the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode features a different topic and a guest who shares their experience and knowledge with us. Tune in and learn something new with BankTalk podcast.
Hi, and welcome to BankTalk. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host and partner at Remedy Consulting. Today, we're talking interchange fees. Very specifically, a client of ours over at Remedy Consulting forwarded an article. This is an article out of Reuters, and the article is titled, U.S. Fed Proposes Shrinking Fees That Banks Charge on Debit Card Transactions. So naturally, I thought, we have not done an episode on interchange fees in a while, and I thought we'd see if we could peel this apart, maybe get down to the basis of the article and whether or not these fees are going to be shrinking. Maybe before that, though, we'll try to provide a little bit of education on just how interchange fees work and where the threat might be coming from with this Fed proposal. So without further ado, I'd like to get to the BankTalk podcast. Today I have with me Rebecca Cruz, who is the ICBA Bank Card Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, and Lance Nagel, who is ICBA's Senior VP of Operations and Senior Regulatory Counsel. I think between those two, hopefully our friends at the ICBA should be able to help us wade through this topic. So let's get to BankTalk. Welcome back to BankTalk. Today I have with me Rebecca Cruz and Lance Nagel from the ICBA. Rebecca and Lance, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so I thought what we would do today, I prepped the audience a little bit on the Reuters article that came out. I think it's important to some of our listeners is to sort of understand the regulatory changes that have affected interchange revenue. And I don't know that I want a full history, Lance, but maybe we could start at Durbin and just kind of talk about some of the items that have come out since that time, or some of the things that are going on, in the court systems to decide what interchange revenue becomes.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And happy to go into a little bit of history. So I'm going to say talk about two separate things here real quick: the Dodd-Frank Act and the Durbin Amendment. And most people have heard a little bit about it both. So the Dodd-Frank Act was passed by Congress in 2010. The Durbin Amendment, which impacts interchange on debit transactions, was part of the Dodd-Frank Act. The thought of it was to reduce the interchange that a bank or credit union could charge on debit transactions. And I think the reason why there was focus on this is at the time, debit card had two networks on them. You could use them as an ATM. You could get cash. You'd put your PIN in. Sometimes you use one at a retailer, and you might pay for whatever your goods or services, and you might be able to get $20 back or whatever, and you would use a PIN. And they also had the signature network. I'm sure everybody remembers that they get a receipt, have to sign it whenever they use their debit card, and that was a signature network that was used there. So the thought was that the PIN or debit networks had a little bit less interchange. They charged a little bit less interchange. And the thought process was that possibly they could use that competition between those two networks to reduce the interchange overall on the use of the debit card. So Congress drafted legislation and they inserted it in this in the Dodd-Frank Act.
Conceptually, was Dodd-Frank and the Durbin Amendment meant to reduce the fees to the consumer or reduce the fees to the merchant so that it became more palatable or cheaper for the consumer? Was that the very high level?
Yeah, the thought process is that it would reduce fees that the merchant would pay, and that the merchant would pass those fees on to the consumer. So it's essentially a price control. Congress passed a price control of, a business transaction.
Gotcha.
So I just wanted to make one point here too, is, even before the Durbin Amendment and before debit cards had the ability, before the Visa and MasterCard logo started showing up on debit cards, you had an ATM card and you had a credit card, and they work vastly different. They look the same and they work vastly different. And I think there's some confusion sometimes from Congress and from others of just the inner workings of them. And that's kind of how we got into this dueling network part of the legislation, which has, at the end of the day, been costly and confusing to consumers, to merchants, and especially it's had an impact on banking over the years. So what happened was that the Federal Reserve was mandated to implement regulation for the Durbin Amendment. It had two parts to it. One was it regulated the fees that a financial institution with 10 billion or over in assets could charge per debit transaction. And there's a super complicated formula that we're not going to go into this. That's been subject to lots of litigation. And also it mandated that for each debit transaction, 2 unaffiliated networks must be available, and the merchant could choose, or the entity accepting the debit card for payment could choose what network that transaction would run across. And that's applicable to all financial institutions. And the thought there is that the interplay between the two networks, or the competition, would also help reduce interchange paid by the merchant for all transactions.
So the merchant could send it to the cheaper of the two networks.
Yeah, the merchant has that choice.
That's an agreement probably between the network and the merchant, as far as what they're going to charge individual merchants.
Sure. And there's many factors in there that go into it, right? There's what the bank charges, and there's acquiring fees, and there's a lot of fees in there. I think one confusion part that merchants will sometimes run into is they think, hey, I paid say $3 in interchange for this transaction. That goes to the bank. There's all sorts of processing fees that go to different entities, that are an essential part of the transaction. So
you're saying it's not flowing all straight through to the card issuer. It gets spread out a little. The love gets spread somewhere.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about just how the fees work. The Fed gives us a nice example on a $50 transaction. So at some point in our conversation, we can sort of go through that too.
I've heard some regulation recently, it seems like, including potentially what this Reuters article is reflecting. Roll us forward a few years, and where do we stand since maybe 2020? Are there things that are being recommended? What changes are they recommending, or are there any changes that they're recommending that would generate a Reuters article or other things?
So we've seen 2 updates to regulations, one proposal, one final rule, since both of those will come out this year. The final rule, it's technical, but it has to do with card not present transactions or pinless debit transactions. Basically, what this said from the Fed, or what the rule was, is that for each transaction or each type of transaction, there needed to be 2 unaffiliated networks, again, because, and the reason why they had to restate this is when the original rule was implemented, a lot of online transactions, only one network was available because there was not pinless debit. This is where it gets complicated.
Okay, so this is just a distinction between what would be a pin transaction versus a pinless.
So sometime prior to 2017, 2018, if you entered a PIN when you used your debit card, it went over what I'll just call the old ATM network. If you had a signature, it went over I'll call the credit card network, even though it's a debit transaction. Originally, it was difficult for retailers online to use a PIN. I don't know anyone that's ever made an online transaction and entered a PIN for verification. So the ATM network owners came up with pinless. That way, their network could be used online without using a PIN. And what had happened, because that wasn't available when the original Durbin Amendment rules were implemented, that may not have been enabled on all transactions. And the Fed came out and said in this year, the final rule, which was compliance date of July 1st, that 2 networks needed to be available for all transactions.
Okay, so really what they were doing there, if I understand that piece of it, and then we'll get to the second part, but if I understand that, what they were trying to do is just clarify that a pinless looked like a PIN transaction. In other words, it's a dual network, the same dual network they had approved way back.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep. And basically this limitation complicating it no longer existed. So now you need to make sure you have that second network enabled.
Okay. And then with the second network enabled, who enabled the network? The merchant? Or, you know what I mean? When you say enabled the network, without getting into too much detail here, right?
The bank is the one who chooses both networks.
Oh, okay. So in other words, the card issuer has to go find a second network.
Yeah.
That's kind of how that works on the
the bank. Yeah, the issuer, exactly.
Okay.
They go out and they find the network. They have to sign a contract. They have to go through the implementation process, which is why it is a compliance issue. It's expensive, so they have to go. You're adding another vendor, so they go through that process. They add a second network.
And if I could jump in there, most of the banks who already had relationships with two unaffiliated debit networks to, comply with the original Durbin were able to leverage those networks to enable pinless point of sale or pinless transactions online. But they did have to go through an implementation process, just like Lance said. And I want to also mention that, there are several debit networks to choose from across the country. And so a bank has to choose two to be affiliated with, and it may be different from the two or more that a merchant has relationships with. And so most of the debit networks have interoperability agreements between them, so that if I'm a merchant and I introduce a transaction to debit network A, but the bank is using B and C, it will still be able to be routed.
So if they choose A and B, and the merchant has different relationships, they can still route them back through those, wherever they decided their card's going to be used, whichever network.
That's right.
Gotcha. Lance, I think I have one more piece for you. You didn't finish. There was a part number 2 to this thing, and which I think is the one that generated the Reuters article. And that part number 2 was sort of the second regulatory change that or clarification, I guess, that's come out in the last couple of years.
Yeah, this one's a little more straightforward. On October 25th, the Federal Reserve, they proposed to amend their current regulation, that the fee cap regulation, and that's the amount that a bank or credit union with $10 billion or over in assets can charge per debit transaction. And this doesn't matter. This is network agnostic. This is a ceiling of how much you can charge, a financial institution can charge for a debit transaction. And again, this was, part of the Durbin Amendment. I think it was the actual rule, because of litigation, had a later compliance state than the routing or the dual network rule. And somewhere around 2015, I think, was the compliance state. And so I'll just go through just kind of a real straightforward example here, what this looks like. So currently, and the Fed gives this example. So on a $50 debit transaction, a $10 billion and over financial institution can charge a maximum of 24.5 cents for that transaction. This is $50. Under the new rule, that would drop down to 17.7 cents. And there's some components to this, and I know Becca will talk a little bit about the components that go into this. When one of them is slightly variable. So, $50 transaction, wherever you go for a $10 billion and over institution, right now, they would receive 24.5 cents, no matter what the merchant pays to their acquirer, and the financial institution receives 24.5 cents, even if the merchant uses an acquirer that uses a blended rate that charges a fixed fee that could be as high as 4%. What the financial institution receives is fixed.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. This is really just what the issuer gets, not what anybody else that's in that stream before the issuer receives.
Correct.
That's all that cap was. Did the cap, the 24 versus the 17, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit there, but 24 versus the 17, was that a change that occurred that is being recommended, or is that a change that has already passed and they're fighting in the courts? Like, where could you give us a little timeline on both?
Yeah. So that's proposed. So the Federal Reserve, they do a payment survey and they issue a report every 2 years. According to the research, the cost of interchange to banks, the cost of providing debit services for banks has gone down, which is why they're proposing to reduce the amount that a bank can charge for interchange.
The banks that will be affected with this, if it passes, is the 10 billion and above banks.
Correct. And I do think that there's some crossover to banks that are with less assets as well, just because of even though you can draw a bright line at an asset level, as Becca's mentioned, it's so interconnected that there's crossover impact.
I gotcha. So Lance, thank you. I appreciate what you put out there. I think that's great information, and you did a great job with it. Becca, I want to turn to you a little bit. I was afraid when we started having this conversation, Bank Talk, that we would be over talking some of the listeners, and specifically because of the complexity of cards. I think we've got customers at Remedy that if you would ask them to look at the invoice and the revenue that's coming out of their network provider, a lot of them just shake their head and go, I know what my dollar is per month. I don't really know how it works. I'm trying to figure out if there's a real clean way to talk about a transaction, let's call it my stop at Walmart to go buy a TV. And once that transaction, I get to the register and I run the transaction on my card. And what I'm trying to understand there is how many different ways can that transaction be routed? How many hands are in the bucket? Between that and the card issuer and the revenue that the card issuer gets, could you just kind of walk us through the various types of transactions and or how the revenue gets split up in between there?
Sure. Be happy to. Typically, when we talk about transactions, we're looking at, what used to be called and is still often called PIN transactions versus signature transactions. PIN transactions are those that typically occur over those debit networks, legacy ATM networks that Lance was referring to earlier. And the signature transactions typically occur through one of the major card brands. A signature transaction is typically referred to in the industry as a dual message transaction. And that means that an authorization goes to the issuer to make sure that the card is available to be used for the amount. And then a day or two later, a second message is sent that posts to the account. So think of a transaction at a restaurant. Hand your card to the waiter. It's swiped or tapped and for the amount of your bill, but you may choose to add a tip. So that initial message is sent for the amount of the bill, but the final posting message is sent for the amount of the bill plus the tip. And so that's why it's called dual message. There are two. So when the posting message comes through, the initial message falls off because they match up or because a certain timer has been hit.
I have to believe that there's got to be some history with this, right? I think of the old, as I'm dating myself, but do you remember when they used to run a card with the carbon copy and all that with the card reader, right? I have to believe that the reason that this exists this way is at some point, you used to sign this thing, and then that either the carbon copy or the original would end up making its way back to the bank. And that would validate whether or not it got paid, I believe. But that concept of first I've got to decide whether or not this signature has gone through, and then I've got to post it to my account. It feels like that. And again, I think you said this was credit network based, right?
Yes, that's the signature transaction. Yep.
Okay. All right. No, that's very helpful. Okay. Thank you.
And then we have the PIN transactions, which are routed through the debit networks. There are debit networks that are affiliated with the major card brands. And then there are independent debit networks, sometimes owned by a processor, sometimes not. And those are the networks that are typically legacy ATM networks. Those are single message, meaning there is no authorization and posting. It's one message, you type in the PIN, and then it's posted to your account that night.
If I have two network providers, does one of them also always have to be the card provider? The MasterCards, the Visas, and Discovers. And again, I'm probably picking some names out that I may not understand entirely, but is when we go to this sort of single network, dual network, is it a requirement that your PIN must go through if you have a Visa card, does it first have to go through Visa or does Visa have to be one of the options?
We'll be right back.
If you're dealing with a technology vendor, consider giving Remedy Consulting a call. At Remedy, we're dedicated to helping our clients get the most out of their tech spend. If you're considering changing one of your major tech providers or are renewing a contract with a vendor, the Remedy team may be able to add some value. Our clients enjoy our deep experience working inside these major vendors, and that background helps us ask questions which eliminate headaches and expense for our clients. Sometimes that's immediate relief, in the way of your vendor invoices. And sometimes that comes in the form of contract language protection for a strategic move that you may want to make several years later. The group of experts at Remedy have years of experience in core systems, digital, mobile, payments, item capture, commercial banking, pretty much the whole gamut of technology for financial institutions. Remedy approaches the BankTalk podcast the same way we approach our client engagements. We always try to fill some knowledge gaps, but also just to have enough life experience stories to remain entertaining. So if you're renewing a technology contract or you have projects going on, just need another opinion or a project manager from outside your organization, reach out to us at remedyconsult.net. Thank you, and we appreciate you downloading the BankTalk podcast. Now let's get back to our episode.
I would say it does not have to be. Visa or MasterCard, for example, are the signature networks. They're, the two largest. Obviously, there are others, Amex, Discover, and those are the dual message single signature transactions. The PIN transactions do not have to go through those networks. They have to go through one of two issuer-enabled debit networks on that card. So when we think about a transaction a card that requires two unaffiliated debit networks, one can be associated with a brand and the other will not be at all associated with a brand.
Okay. So if you are an issuer and you really knew how to shop this stuff, you would be shopping for the two networks that are going to bring you the highest revenue. Let them compete for the PIN business with the merchant. Am I thinking about that right? Or did I just make some leap into Twilight Zone?
I mean, that's part of it. Generally, what we see with banks, and in my personal experience, we look for the least expense to the bank. Of course, there's interchange revenue associated with card transactions, but there's also a lot of expense. And you nailed that when you started this question about looking at your invoice from a brand. So a bank is paying the network or networks, right? So there's a major brand. There are the unaffiliated debit networks. There is the processor. All of those come with daily, weekly, monthly, annual startup expenses.
Sure.
So typically, I mean, yes, you'd want to make the most revenue, of course, but in my experience, it's where am I going to pay the least expense?
It's net revenue.
That's correct.
So you want to look at the difference between who pays the most, less how much bill you got coming out of that. So you end up with something in your own pocket.
That's right.
Yeah, I was just going to add, and some of that could be just like the partners you choose to work with, what they have available and what works best with them as well, like what processors you choose and things like that. So it sounds like when you think about it, when you initially think about it, you're going to go, yeah, you're just going to choose the one that's both that are going to give you the most revenue. As Becca said, it probably doesn't work that way. There's a lot of moving parts though.
Excellent. Okay. No, that's great. And I think, again, just it's really interesting to hear the history of these networks, because you do think if you got enough gray hairs on you, you think back to the initialization of the ATM networks, right? Getting $20 out of the ATM machine back in the day. And then you also think about, running that credit transaction, which was, for the most part, a merchant-based transaction. And it's somewhere down the road, they merged because the use of the card became all-inclusive. So just the way you described the history, I think to me is kind of interesting that there are two sort of separate networks, and the reason they grew up was two different reasons, but over time they merged.
Kind of why a debit card and a credit card, they look the same, but they're really quite different. People are kind of like, hey, this is really the same. Obviously, one is a credit transaction, the other one removes money from your deposit account, but they just came from completely different places and slightly merged together.
I'll start with Becca if I could, but Becca, is there anything else we missed? I know we prepped for this a little bit, and as usual, when you get into a podcast, you never get through everything you talked about or you wanted to talk about. Is there anything else we missed here that you think might be important to the listeners?
You touched on pinless transactions running over the debit networks, and I just wanted to kind of clarify how that actually looks. A pinless point of sale transaction can occur in person or online. Lance mentioned the clarification that occurred recently that online transactions have to be able to be run over one or two debit networks. And so those are run exactly like a transaction where you type in the PIN, whether you're in person or it's online.
And again, without getting too complicated, is a tap to pay, does it fit into that general pinless category, or is that an entirely different category of its own?
It can, right? And so when we think about fees and interchange and all the different possible combinations, we're looking at how the transaction was entered, whether it was swiped, inserted, tapped, typed in, and typed in includes online transactions. And that's not the technical word, but that's the word I'm using today.
Yeah. Nice.
What kind of card it is? Business card? Is it commercial, small business, consumer? Is it high net worth? Is it not? And where is the transaction occurring? Is it at a wholesale store? Is it at travel and entertainment? And so every single combination of all of those things really dictate what the fees are that are associated with that transaction, and then what the interchange might be. And along the way, when we're talking about interchange, Lance said, this proposed rule would cap the amount a bank can earn, but doesn't really mention those along the way. So you're looking at the merchant service provider, you're looking at the acquirer, you're looking at the network, whether it's a, debit or credit network, and then you're looking at the bank. So there are several entities along the way that each earn a little bit of that interchange, and how much they earn is based on the combination of how that transaction occurs and their agreements. So economies of scale, generally larger entities are able to negotiate more favorable agreements.
To me, I always thought there was a bit of a disconnect between the issuer. This is kind of seen as revenue, but you made a really good point, which is you have a bunch of expense to the issuer along the way. So when you talk about how much revenue comes to the issuer, it's issuer less whoever took their toll between the time it left the merchant and ended up at the issuer. So,
right.
To me, there's this weird dynamic of, and again, this kind of goes back to, if you ever looked at a couple of those invoices, they come at different times of the month. They come it is really hard to say this transaction started at 50 cents and ended up at, 3, or to me, right? Or whatever it is. I'm making up numbers, of course, but it is, you would need a master's degree in cards to figure out one transaction, how it went through the pipeline, what it paid up front, and what you got paid for at the back end.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why we typically look at blended interchange across, your consumer portfolio versus your business, debit versus credit. So we in the industry look at blended interchange, just because it's so difficult to get down and pinpoint. Of course, you can narrow that down by industry or types of vendors, that kind of thing. Yeah. And, one thing I didn't mention in regard to expense is the fraud cost. And I know that this rule is lowering the cap for fees, but it's increasing the fraud allowance from a penny to 1.3. And that's for fraud prevention. I would question that 0.3 cents and how much that's helping with fraud prevention. But we also have to look at fraud losses, right? So merchants definitely take losses, banks take losses, and the loss itself can be impactful, but also the cost to process those losses. Think about the whole chargeback process, who was liable and going back and forth. That costs both banks and merchants just to make that decision.
No, that's a great perspective. If I understood the math, and again, I'll walk this, but I thought I understood that for these $10 billion and over banks, the potential fee went from somewhere around 24 cents down to 17. And you're saying that the increase, and again, maybe this is an apple and an orange, but the increase for fraud loss is 0.3 pennies. So it went from 17.3 to 17.6. And again, I'm making numbers up, but am I getting those numbers relatively correct? In other words, it's a 7-cent drop off because, at least in the opinion of somebody there, that is the reduction in expense to the card issuer. 7 cents, a third of the overall transaction. and the bump up was 0.3 of a penny. Is that right, Lance? Did I get that? Or did I make that up?
It's for fraud loss prevention. So they give a little bit extra there, but they drop down like the component for fraud.
Yeah, but they dropped it 7 cents and raised it 0.3 of a cent.
Yeah, there's 3 components to it. They have this ad valorem piece, which is 4 basis points times the transaction value. So that gives it a little bit of, so it's not completely fixed.
Yeah,
so
I got you.
There's a very small variable point. And the fraud prevention, they break this out. Fraud prevention is going from 1 cent to 1.3 cents.
Nice.
So
I could talk about this for 3 more hours, but I don't think we have the time. So I'll stop for now.
Lance, on your end, anything else we didn't cover or anything else I shorted you on?
Really, obviously this is important, but one thing we didn't go over is why we're here and why this is important to community banks, to banks in general, and to credit unions. And it's this long, the Durbin Amendment is this long effort by retailers to reduce interchange. It's a cost to them, and any amount they can reduce it is extra revenue, extra profit for retailers, which is why they've had a long history of lobbying for these changes. Currently, as I mentioned, Durbin doesn't apply to credit cards, but there is a legislation called the Consumer Credit Card Act that's in Congress that would apply the dual network provision to credit cards that's currently on debit cards, which would be disastrous because credit cards they've never had dual networks. Credit cards are a loan. Oftentimes if you pay your credit card monthly, you're still given up to a 45, and Becca will know this way better than me, up to like a 45-day loan, the float that you have. So there's this long effort to reduce interchange, whether it's through legislation, whether through this rulemaking that we have now, or whether it's through litigation suing over the rules. It's been disastrous for our members, for community banks, and for consumers, because there's studies have been done by the Fed that none of the reduction has been passed on to consumers. It's all gone into the pocket of the retailers, and it's hurt community banks' ability to offer products at times. What really hurts about this reduction and this proposed rule that we've been talking about is that part of this is in law is supposed to be cost recovery for the debit transaction, variable cost for the bank. But it's reduced so much that a lot of banks that are, barely in the $10 billion space, they will lose money per debit transaction because they don't have as low fixed costs as, a larger institution. So it's making it difficult for our members to compete and to offer products at times. So it's again, we understand why the retailers would like to do this. It's like any cost, you want it to go down, but the part that's really bothersome to us is that they've been able to get the federal government to step in between two businesses and set costs.
So as I think about the concept of if I was listening throughout this podcast, if I think of this concept of a credit card transaction that has a single network,
mm-hmm.
and the introduction of a second network, which doesn't exist today.
Correct.
Keep me honest, but is the primary network in that scenario is always the card provider? It's the MasterCard, Visa, Discover?
Yeah, one of those, whoever's brand.
Would it be fair to say that any of the independent networks might be lobbying for this to actually happen? In other words, right, the banker with competition in there amongst two networks, I think I heard maybe Becca say, with competition amongst the two networks, it becomes potentially cheaper for the merchant. But isn't it also another revenue stream for these independent networks that are not MasterCard, Visa, or Discover?
I don't think I'd be going out too far to limb to say it's been good for their business. A place your business did not exist, the government steps in and goes, hey, the business must use your services. And
right.
4 or 5 of you or however many, they're going to have to choose one of them. So yeah, it's good for their business.
Okay. So it feels like Iowa.
That's kind of a unique circumstance. But,
No. I'm sorry.
And the real charge is by the retailers. It's the largest retailers, because unfortunately, your mom and pop shops are often using something like, and I hate to throw this out there, but everyone will know who this is. It's like Square. If you look and see what they charge, it's quite a bit more than, the financial institution gets as we've talked about it. Really, it's this, at the end of the day, it's a fight by the largest of retailers to lower their costs.
Right. And if they don't pass it on to the consumer, then it sort of becomes irrelevant. I mean, it's a profit thing.
And the reason why the credit card market is concerning is because credit cards don't have a dual network now. I mean, it's a loan that a consumer is getting, whether if they pay it off monthly or they choose to revolve and pay off over a period of time. It's a loan, so there's even a cost of funds. So if you reduce the interchange to nothing on a credit card, it wouldn't work because you have this cost of funds that the bank that extends for a short period of time. And that would cause them to lose money even there. I mean, the interchange, pays for the ability to do that. And it's been a boon for the sales of all sorts of things. But there have been businesses that have gone cashless. One is Mercedes-Benz. I was just reading about this the other day. I think it's the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. They went cashless and they've ended up saving quite a bit of money in the tune of like $35 million annually by not accepting cash, because there's a cost to that. There's just this kind of back and forth tension. But the concern is that if you add a different network to credit cards, we don't know what impact that would have, but it could fundamentally change the way credit cards work. And, from what we see now.
Yeah, and honestly, it could force up the cost of actually holding the credit card for the consumer.
Yeah, exactly.
Oddly, right? I mean, it would be right. You just took it from you put a little more revenue into the retailer's pocket and took it directly out of the consumers, even though you were telling.
Yeah,
I would imagine your PR pitch for that is just the opposite of that.
And it is something that we've ICBA and others have spent quite a bit of time working with Congress, working with the Senate, just to raise awareness that, hey, this everyone is comfortable with how credit cards work, but this change really can have an impact, and we really don't know what it would do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time, Becca, Lance. Thank you for joining us on Bank Talk today. You've been very informational. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah. I'd love to come back, discuss debit credit cards more.
Excellent.
Agree. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Becca. So that's it for Bank Talk. Really appreciate Lance and Becca spending a little bit of time with us today. I know we've spent a little bit of time on interchange fees in previous episodes, but as this has the potential to affect both revenue and expense for many of our bank issuers out there and credit card or credit union issuers as well. I just think it's always important to hear it from the horse's mouth, hear it from the experts. And to me, it's always fascinating to hear the regulatory update as well. Just kind of what regulatory fight's going on, who's fighting, and how does the ICBA and other bank associations kind of protect your backside? What are they fighting for and who they're fighting is always pretty important. So that's it for Bank Talk today. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for listening to the Bank Talk podcast brought to you by Remedy Consulting. To get in touch with Lance or Becca at the ICBA, go out to their website, icba.org. In the spirit of gratitude this holiday season, the Bank Talk podcast is giving away 20 coffee mugs that have our logo on them. If you are interested in this, please email your name and physical address to Lauer, LOWERR, at remedyconsult.net. And we will send that out in the mail. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.